Welcome to Free-to-Play Academy. I'm Voodoo1 and I'll be providing you our second guide to speed and turn order. Today we'll be diving into more advanced and complex mechanics that define speed and turn order and how it actually works in the background. We'll be learning about action gauge modifiers and other invisible stats. Understand these and you may emerge triumphant in your battles with some insane strategies. Action gauge isn't something players can see, however it is crucial to understand how action value or AV is calculated and how speed, advance forward and action delay relate to the final displayed value in the action order. The action gauge is a hidden meter the game uses to calculate how far away a character is from acting. This gauge has an initial value of 10,000 which decreases until it hits 0. Let's deconstruct a combat scenario to show how speed works. During combat everyone starts at 10,000 action gauge or AG. The game divides action gauge by speed to find each character's action value and then they are arranged from the lowest to highest AV in order to determine the action order. In the case of decimal answers, the displayed AV is rounded up regardless of how small of a decimal it is. For every one AV that passes, a character's current speed is subtracted from that action gauge. If a character's AV has not reached 0, this process will repeat constantly until someone can act. After acting, their AG goes back to its initial value of 10,000 and then they are placed back in the action order accordingly. An illustration of real-time AV consumption is shown on the screen. The action gauge of any unit can be determined in real time by current action gauge equals current AV times current speed. A has 120 speed, which means that 10,000 action gauges divided by 120 speed is equal to 83 plus 1/3. Round it up and you get 84 action value. B has 100 speed, which means that 10,000 action gauges divided by 100 speed is exactly 100. C has 90 speed, which means that 10,000 action gauges divided by 90 speed is equal to 110 plus 10 divided by 9. Round it up and you get 112 action value. Now everyone advances in AV until A reaches 0. A is placed back in the action order queue based on their speed. Everyone advances in AV until B reaches 0. This is how AVs work in a nutshell. AG modifiers such as advance and delay are effects that subtract or add fixed amounts to the action gauge. 1% of AG is equal to 100 units of action gauge. Since the action gauge needs to reach 0 before a character can act, a 1% advance forward will decrease the action gauge by 100 and a 1% action delay will increase the action gauge by 100. However, a character cannot be advanced further if their action gauge is at 0. AG modifiers also only affect the turn they are applied on and do not affect the action gauge of future turns. The effects of action gauge modifiers are described in this formula. New action gauge equals the maximum of 0 and the current action gauge minus 10,000 times the quantity of advance forward percentage minus action delay percentage. When a character's action is advanced by 100, their AV is immediately set to 0 and they will act as soon as possible, after any queued ultimates and passives. Since only their AV is set to 0, when they act, no other character action value is decreased until after they finish their turn. In the event of consecutive 100% advance forwards, the last character to be advanced will act first. Speed buffs and debuffs directly affect the speed stat of a character and determine how often a character can act. If a character has a high speed stat, they will act more often. If a character has a low speed stat, they will act less often. Because the action gauge is decreased by your current speed for every one AV that passes, speed buffs and debuffs will increase and decrease your action value by a larger value when your current action gauge is high and vice versa. When taking into account speed, action value and action gauge, we can determine the initial order of every character and enemy without any external effects through the calculation. Base AV equals default AG divided by speed. Default AG is 10,000. The equation to calculate your new action value under effects of speed buffs and debuffs without AG modifiers is new AV equals current AV times current speed divided by new speed. Combining these action gauge modifier formula, we get a general action value equation under any speed and action modifiers. New AV equals current AV times current speed divided by new speed minus 10,000 times the quantity of advance forward minus action delay that divided by new speed. Speed value depends on how fast it can translate into impactful and practical discrete extra actions a character can take. There is no absolute rule about how many extra actions speed should convert into it for it to be worth it compared to the more traditional offensive stats. And the choice between more or less speed should be made depending on characters and teams. Generally, a good practice is making the most efficient speed investments possible for it to convert into discrete actions that are foreseeable in around 4 turns, allowing one to make good short-term planning. The equation to visualize how many actions speed actually gives is extra action divided by action taken equals new speed divided by current speed minus 1. Example, a 125 speed character would act 125 divided by 100 minus 1 equals 0.25 extra action for every action taken by a 100 speed character. And they would act 5 times instead of 4 times for the same AV taken. Ultimates are special abilities which can be used anytime ignoring the current action order. A character's turn only ends once AV is subtracted. So to keep buffs active, players can take their normal action and then quickly ultimate on the same character to retain buffs from that turn. Additionally, ultimates can be used immediately upon initiating combat, before any AV has been subtracted. This can reveal every character's base AV upon starting combat and allow players to act before enemies quickly if they are slower. Toughness break. When breaking an enemy's toughness meter, the broken enemy receives a 25% action delay to their upcoming action, thus adding 2500 to their current action gauge. This value is not affected by break effect percentage. Certain elemental toughness break effects have additional action gauge modifiers. Imprisonment imaginary. When triggering a toughness break with an imaginary character, enemies become imprisoned. Imprison applies a 10% speed debuff as well as 30% action delay. This action delay is affected by break effect percentage, but the speed debuff is not. The action delay value is described in the equation. Final action delay percentage equals 30% times the quantity of 1 plus break effect percentage. Entanglement quantum. When triggering a toughness break with a quantum character's enemies become entangled. Entanglement applies a 20% action delay as well as a stacking damage over time, triggering upon the enemy's next turn. This action delay and DOT damage are affected by break effect percentage. The action delay value is described in the equation. Final action delay percentage equals 20% times the quantity of 1 plus break effect percentage. Frozen ice. When triggering toughness break with ice, enemies become frozen. When a frozen enemy reaches its turn and unfreezes, it takes 1 instance of ice DOT, is unable to act for that turn, and receives a 50% advance forward on its next turn. Only the DOT is affected by break effect percentage. Ambushes. In the event of an ambush, all characters are pushed back 20 AV in the action order, regardless of speed or any other AG modifiers. In conclusion, understanding the mechanics of action gauge modifiers, speed buffs and debuffs, ultimates and other hidden stats is crucial for mastering gameplay in honkaistarrail. The action gauge, although invisible to players, determines when characters can act and starts at an initial value of 10,000, decreases until it reaches 0. The action value is calculated by dividing the action gauge by a character's speed, and the resulting values determine the action order. Decimal AVs are rounded up. Action gauge modifiers like advance and delay introduce fixed amounts to the action gauge, affecting the turn they are applied to. Speed buffs and debuffs directly impact a character's speed stat, determining their frequency of actions. Higher speed allows more actions while lower speed results in reduced activity. Understanding the interaction between speed action value and action gauge helps determine the initial order of characters and enemies. Ultimates offer strategic advantages, allowing actions outside the regular order. Using an ultimate after normal action detains buffs, and ultimates can be used at the beginning of combat to gain advantages. Certain actions and effects modify the action gauge, such as breaking an enemy's toughness meter, which adds an action delay. Elemental toughness break effects introduce additional modifiers like speed debuffs and damage over time effects. Ambushes push all characters back 20 points in the action order regardless of speed or other modifiers. By grasping these mechanics in honkaistarrail, players can develop effective strategies, make informed decisions about speed investments, and leverage ultimates and combat abilities for that advantage in the game. I hope you enjoyed our guide on speed and turn order in honkaistarrail. I'm Budavan, and it has been a pleasure providing you with valuable insights into the mechanics of the game. Keep practicing and honing your skills, and I hope we see each other later at Free to Play Academy.